We look in chapter 8 this morning of 1 Samuel. We're talking about change, the potential, the pitfalls of change. We're all familiar with change, aren't we? Because we live in a world of change, an ever-changing world. Someone has said that the only constant in life is change. I think that is quite true. We change from season to season, 4 seasons. Like we've been hearing about, some people have more extreme seasons than we have here. But we live in seasons of change, literally. We see changes with governments, with leaders. There's constant change in that area. There's change with trends and fads. We're kind of fickle that way. You know, some clothing you have in your wardrobe that might be in style now. Tomorrow, it probably won't be because somebody said it's not in style anymore. There are certain fads, certain things we're interested in, and then suddenly we lose interest. I even think about news. You know, there are big events that take place, even disasters. And that's all you hear about for a while on the news, and all of a sudden, that's it. You don't hear about it anymore. And so, change in that respect. Philosophies. There are certain guiding philosophies that are popular today, and tomorrow, not so much, replaced by something else. So you get the idea that we live in a world of change. There are times when there are changes that must be made. There are situations where a change needs to happen. Sometimes something becomes obsolete and unnecessary. It's time for a change. This may seem like a minor example, but way back when I was in high school, in math class, we used a slide rule. Sure. Then came those real expensive calculators. They said there's going to be a day you don't need the slide rule anymore. And the calculators got cheaper. You can pick them up at the dollar store today. It's amazing. Then comes the computers. We pretty much all have a computer or access to one. And so who needs a slide rule anymore? And the younger people today in here are saying, what is a slide rule? That's how obsolete it is. So again, change, and sometimes change that needs to be made. Someone has said that all change is not growth, as all movement is not forward. Keeping that thought in mind as we look at a chapter that deals with change, 1 Samuel 8, first 3 verses. And it came about when Samuel was old, that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah, and they were judging in Beersheba. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain, and took bribes and perverted justice. You're going to say, so what's new? That sounds like things that happen today. So our focus has been Samuel in our recent studies. Samuel was, as we know, a God-appointed judge of Israel. God raised him up to be a judge, because that's the way it was in those days. God raised up judges. The whole book of Judges are about those judges that God raised up, and I emphasize the fact that God raised them up. Judges chapter 2, verse 16 says that the Lord raised up judges who saved them from the power of their marauders or their enemies. So in times of crisis with Israel, God would raise up men and women to serve as a judge, to show some oversight over the nation of Israel. So God raised up the judges. And again, that's a point to really notice. The Lord raised up judges. They were not selected. They were not elected by the people. God himself raised them up. Samuel was one of those godly judges that God had raised up. And although Samuel was certainly a godly man, in this passage we notice there were 2 very key mistakes that this godly man made. Number 1, you notice in the text it says that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. God didn't raise him up. Samuel decided it would be a good idea for his sons to be judges over Israel. We can ask the question, did he have the right to do so? Probably not, because again, God raises them up. And secondly, and this is probably the worst part of it, it says that his sons did not walk in his ways. So Samuel made a couple of rather serious mistakes. He made a decision, number one, that he did not have a right to make because that's God's business, not his. And secondly, the decision that he made was a very bad decision. And I guess the takeaway right away is that godly people don't always do the right thing. We're all people and we're all imperfect. And no matter how godly we might be, we're capable of certainly making bad decisions. And Samuel made a bad decision here. So if you read down in verses 4 and 5, it says, "Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, 'Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways.'" So the wisest of men in Israel got their heads together, said, "We need to have a talk with Samuel." So the first thing they had to say to Samuel was pretty much stating the obvious. "Samuel, you're an old man." I suppose Samuel could have said, "Well, tell me something I don't know." Yeah. "Samuel, you're an old man. You've kind of come to the end of your time of service, and apparently you have made a very, very bad decision because your sons do not walk in your ways. So you have made some decisions as an elderly man that you did not have a right to make. So as an old man, you've made this bad decision concerning your sons." So we get the idea the nation of Israel is in a time of crisis because judges were very, very important. God had been raising them up and saving them from disaster. And so now here the latest judge is Samuel, that God had raised up near the end of his life. He's taken upon himself to appoint his sons who are not godly men. And so obviously, something had to be done. Can I bring it down to an example for you? You might gather to me and say, "Pastor, you've grown old. And you know what? We need a succession plan here because you can't be pastor forever." And so I might respond to that and say, "Yeah, okay, I agree, I'm old. But I got a plan. I got a great plan for you. I know this young guy. He's a really good young guy. He's really good with people. He's really a good speaker. He really would be a good pastor. Did I tell you he's a young guy? Did I tell you that he's good with people? Did I tell you that he's a good speaker? By the way, there's one other thing I should tell you. He's an atheist." Okay, you would have every right to say, "That's your plan?" It's a disaster, hardly a very good plan. We have got to come up with something else. That's the situation the elders were in Israel. And so we've got to have a better plan. And so, this thing with Samuel and this succession plan that's in place that we've been reading about, this was not a new thing, because we want to go back for a moment to the beginning of the book of Samuel. And you remember the setting. There was Eli the priest. Y'all remember Eli? Eli the priest just happened to have some very wicked sons as well. And so they were in a time of crisis. In fact, it's kind of interesting how history repeats itself. Here Samuel now is the old man instead of Eli. And notice about his sons, they're not exactly godly men either. And I think about the influence of Eli. You remember the circumstances of Samuel's birth? His mother Hannah had prayed for a son. She said, "I'll dedicate him to the Lord. I'll take him to the temple service." So when he was of age, she brought him in. Basically, Eli the priest was his father who raised him. And so later on in life, you see the same thing going on. So Samuel's sons are not exactly godly men either. And so back at that time, change was desperately needed. And now here Israel is at another point in time when change is desperately needed. Well, God had a plan during the crisis with Eli. Again, we think about Samuel's mother Hannah and how God miraculously raised up Samuel at that time of need. Samuel, was God's appointed solution at that time. And so here we are at this crisis that we're reading about in chapter 8. And I wonder, and all I can do is wonder, did possibly God have a solution for that crisis at that time, waiting in the wings like Samuel when he was a little boy? And I would dare to say, I believe that God did have a solution, something besides what Samuel had devised, and something better than what the elders are going to devise, as we'll read in a little bit. Because I believe this, that God always raises up key people in times of need. We believe that, don't we? God always raises up key people for the need of the hour. And we can claim that as a church. God always raises up key people in our times of need. I think of late we've talked about we have a need for more workers in the church, in particular teachers. And we can look at a situation like that and we can fret about it and say, oh, it's too bad we don't have more workers. We can come up with our own plan. Or we could even pray about it. That seems like a pretty good idea. And as we do so, God might be touching us and raising us as individuals. Say, I want to use you for the job, for the need of the hour. We can do that because, again, I believe that God's work is never deprived of God's supply. It works that way. If it's God's work, God has a supply to meet the need, and we believe that in faith. I think about Jesus' words, Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9, verses 37 and 38, may be very familiar to you, where Jesus says, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers, the workers, are few. So he points out the disparity. There's a great harvest, there's great work to be done, but the laborers and the workers are so few. But what does he say in response to that? Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into the harvest. God has a plan to raise up the workers. Pray that the Lord of the harvest will send them. James 4 verse 2 says, you do not have because you do not ask. How many great things like that do we not have because we have not specifically asked God to supply what God is richly able to supply for the need? Go back to our story here in chapter 8. Verse 5, the elders of Israel who had come to Samuel and questioned the plan that he put in place suggested this as a solution. They said, appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. Samuel, you're an old man. The end of your days is at hand. Your sons are not a great succession plan. We've got a crisis here. So here's our idea. We want to be like all the other nations. Give us a king, and that'll take care of the problem. We want a king instead of a judge. Now, there's a big difference between a judge and a king in terms of Israel in particular. As we said, a judge was raised up by God in a time of crisis, and then after the crisis was over, the judge kind of just receded into the background. Now we're saying we don't want judges anymore, we want a king. Now this is something a little more lasting, because this king is not going to just fade away. If we get a king, we're going to have kind of a king forever. I don't know who came up with the idea of the monarchy with England, but it started a long time ago, and it stays in place, and it probably is going to keep right on. That's a perpetual system. That's essentially what they're saying is we want a government. We want something other than you, God. We want this government. We want this lasting institution, something that will continue from generation to generation. They toyed with this idea before during the time when Gideon was a judge. We've heard of Gideon. Gideon was a judge, and the people wanted him to be king. And it says in Judges chapter 8, verse 28, when Gideon was approached about this, Gideon said to the elders, the people of Israel, he says, I will not rule over you, and my sons will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. So he said, it's a bad idea. God has designed you as his called people, that God be the king, that God be in charge. Far be it that I would take the place of God. And so Gideon flatly turns down this whole idea. And so it is a very bad idea to try to replace the plan of God with our own plan. That is exactly what the elders are proposing here. So the elders had come forward knowing there was a need in the hour, which was a wise thing to do, but the idea they have come up with is certainly not a good idea. So verses 6 to 9, it says, "But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' And Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, 'Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them.'" Samuel had come up with a bad idea. Samuel had come up with the wrong idea. The elders have now proposed, we should say, at least as bad of an idea. And so Samuel apparently is offended by this whole thing. And what is it that he did? He did that which any godly person should do. It says that Samuel prayed to the Lord. He and God obviously were on a first-name basis, God speaking very freely to him as a judge. And notice that God's response to Samuel basically is, "Don't take it personally, Samuel, because they're not really rejecting you, they are rejecting me." And so by wanting a king, they have rejected God himself. And what it was they really wanted, it would seem, at least to me, was not so much a king. They wanted a substitute God, because that's the real heart of the matter. They wanted a God they could see. And you know, that gets right down to the issue of idolatry, which certainly was a problem throughout their history, and it's not something we're over today. Idolatry is still an issue, and that is a God that we can see and that we can touch, because that seems to be what people really want. The people of Israel wanted to be like everybody else, like all the other nations. And yet God had called them with a distinct call and a distinct identity. They were not to be like every other nation. We can take a lesson from that. We can take a look as a church and say, you know, it would be great if we could be successful like businesses and corporations, and we could probably name a few, and say, wouldn't it be great if we could have the kind of success that they have? And yet to realize, wait a minute, we're not the same, are we? We're like Israel in a sense. Is God at the very center of that? I seriously doubt it with secular corporations. So we can look on the outside and see how they work and say we want to be like them. But like Israel, we are not like them. And so that would be a great mistake. Verses 10 to 18, I'm not going to read those verses, but since you're open there, I want you to take a look, because Samuel outlines exactly what's going to happen if we select a king. And I might entitle that whole section, "Be Careful What You Ask For," because what you want may not be the best thing for you. And so basically what's outlined here is, if it is a king that you want, then here's what it's going to cost you to have a king. And as you look into those verses, for one thing, if you have a king, he's going to make personal servants out of some of your people. He's going to force some of your people into military duty. He's going to institute a draft, so to speak. He's going to require 1/10 of your possessions. Aha, taxes. We're going to have taxes if we have a king. Aren't we excited about that? And ultimately, you're not going to be happy with the guy anyway. You're going to pick government apart. I guess we've been doing that for a long time. You're going to pick the king apart and say, we're not happy with him. And God says, on that day when you're not happy with this solution, I'm not going to listen to you, because you have operated against my will. So, to summarize that, if I could parody the title of a book by a former president, really we're talking about change that you cannot believe in. That's all I'll say about that. Verses 19 and 20. Some of you didn't even get that, I'll bet. Go home and think about it. Nevertheless, verse 19, it says, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. You see how they're repeating that again? We want to be like everybody else, which really indicates to me they have really lost sight of their identity as God's chosen people. We want to be like everybody else. And so they made a horrible decision, and they will live with the consequences. I want you to turn over for a moment to Romans chapter 1. You say, wait a minute, where are we going with that? Romans chapter 1, someone has said this is possibly the most politically incorrect chapter in the entire Bible, and I suppose so, but it really parallels pretty closely what we're looking at in 1 Samuel 8 here this morning. If you're in Romans chapter 1, you get down to verse 20, and it says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what he has made, so that they are without excuse." God can clearly be identified as the king of the universe if you take a good look around at what he has made, is what Paul is telling us there. If you look around at nature, there is abundant evidence that God made it all, and so there is a God. So anyone that looks is without excuse because God has made it all. But verse 21 says, "For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish hearts were darkened." I read that verse and liken that to what we read in 1 Samuel 8. It's just about like asking for a king. God is king over us, but when we refuse to acknowledge God as king, rejecting him and his plan, things get a lot worse. Choosing a God we can see seems to be in play in Romans 1 as in what we just read in 1 Samuel. And that leads, according to what Paul says here, leads to a darkened mindset. It ultimately leads to a depraved lifestyle, according to verses 24 to 27. I don't want to read those, but they're very politically incorrect. But the consequences of a bad decision. And so the point of this chapter, Romans chapter 1, the point of 1 Samuel chapter 8, is indeed the consequences of decisions that are made. And so in essence, make a personal choice, even as a group, make a corporate choice, and you will live with the consequences of that decision. And indeed, we're living in a world that's dealing with the consequences of a very bad decision back in the Garden of Eden. God offered choices, as he's offered all throughout the ages. They made the worst possible choice. And so the problems we deal with today are largely because of that. But again, make a choice and know that you will live with the consequences. And so there are consequences to every decision made, both good and bad. And so the challenge out of these two chapters we've looked at is we do well to choose wisely. It is given that there will be times of crisis when there is a demand and a call for change. Again, thinking about old man Samuel and his wicked sons, there was a need for a change during that particular time. And certainly we live in an age of crisis when there are changes that are needed. I could go on and on about all the issues that are being faced today where changes are needed. Most recently, we're looking at inflation. We're looking at a supply chain shortage. But it's a lot worse than that. We live in an age when people increasingly look at Christian morality as not only old-fashioned, but extreme and even dangerous. We're on the outside in this culture today. And so we live in a moral revolution in the culture that we live in. Long-standing beliefs that have been around for centuries are being turned upside down in short order in this day and age. There is change around us, and it is not good change. There is a need for good change. People also are increasingly isolated, fragmented, polarized. Thank you, social media. We've got all of that to deal with. There are those changes in our midst. So indeed, we live in a culture of crisis. And the $50,000 question is, how ought we as the people of God respond to such things? We need a great deal of wisdom. We must not be hasty. We must not be emotional, as Israel was in their time of crisis. We should certainly make sure that nothing replaces God on his throne. But if we would make a wrong choice, are we so stubborn that we would not walk back from unwise decisions? Look again at 1 Samuel 8. When after hearing of the consequences of a king, it says the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. They said, "No, there shall be a king over us," because we want to be like all the other nations. So what stands out from them that comes down to us is to always remember that we are different from the people of the world. We are a called out people. We are a new Israel of sorts. And it's so important that we keep our identity in mind. I'm reminded in Romans 12, verse 2, a couple paraphrases, and I like how those are worded. The New Living Translation says, "Don't copy the behavior and customs of the world." That's what Israel was doing, and it is a warning to us that we ought not to do that either. The Phillips translation says, "Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold. If we're not careful, it will." And we may look out and say, we want to be squeezed into that mold. We got to be careful. Israel wanted a king like every other nation. But you know, there was a time back in the beginning of this country when the colonists of the United States dared to declare, "We recognize no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus." Boy, talk about politically incorrect today. Boy, does that tell you how far we have come? Back in that day when there was an oppressive king set over them, we recognize no sovereign but God, the creator of the universe. We recognize no king but Jesus. That had to be the point most controversial, at least today. And you know, that sure would have been a better response for the people of Israel back then. To have said, "No, we don't want a king. No, what we want is God to be God." And of course, if they lived in this age, to be able to say, "We have no king and we want no king but King Jesus." That ought to be the rallying cry for us always, shouldn't it? No king but Jesus. Israel presumptuously picked a human king. God had already picked a king before his existence, the king that he's picked for us today. Revelation 19:16 describes that king. He has a name written on his robe and on his thigh: King of Kings and Lord of Lords. No king but Jesus. So we ought to reject any wrongful ruler who would take the place of our Heavenly Father and his appointed, anointed King, Jesus. No king but Jesus. We want that king to come back soon, don't we? We keep praying, "Jesus, come." The worse times get, the more fervently we pray for the coming of Christ. Even so, Lord Jesus, come. We want him to be the personal king of every individual before that return, though. There's a lot of people that haven't made him personal king. Maybe there's some in this room or some watching today that have not. I want to tell you, it's of the utmost urgency that you know the rightful king of God as Lord and Savior. That you accept in faith what God has raised up, who God has raised up as a king. Accepting it in faith and signifying it by decision of baptism. Water baptism followed by Spirit baptism. I want you to think about that as we conclude this morning. Have you made a deliberate choice to accept Jesus as King into your life, into your heart? Have you taken the step of baptism? If not, I urge you to seriously consider it. If you have not taken those steps, I think that we need to talk, and probably the sooner the better would be a really good idea.